Sometimes the hardest thing in life is believing you deserve to be loved. Clara Weston knew that feeling all too well. She traveled hundreds of miles to marry a man she'd never met, only to discover he'd died 3 days before she arrived. Standing, alone in the Wyoming wilderness with winter approaching, she had nowhere to go and no one who cared. That's when Luke Carver, a quiet mountain man scarred by his own past, offered her shelter. He didn't make promises or speak fancy words. He just showed her day by day what kindness looked like. In the silence of that remote cabin, two broken people found something neither thought possible anymore. But could love really grow in such a lonely place? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside McCready's trading post, and Clara Weston felt every bone in her body protest the movement. 6 weeks of travel had worn her down to something she barely recognized. Her dress was rumpled beyond redemption. Her hair had long since given up any pretense of propriety, and the dust of the Wyoming territory seemed to have permanently settled into every crease of her skin. She stepped down onto the wooden planks, with legs that had forgotten how to be steady, clutching her carpet bag like it was the only solid thing left in the world. The trading post squatted at the base of mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Clara had never seen country like this. Back in Philadelphia, the buildings pressed close together, shutting out the sky and creating a world of shadows and narrow alleys. Here, the land stretched forever in every direction. It made her feel small and exposed, like a child caught in the open with nowhere to hide. "Miss Weston." The voice came from her left, deep and careful. She turned and saw him for the first time. Luke Carver stood in the shade of the trading post's overhang, a tall man gone lean from hard living. He wore work clothes that had seen many seasons, a jacket that might have been brown once, but had faded to the color of old leather. His face was weathered, lined at the eyes and mouth, in the way of men who'd spent their years squinting into sun and wind. A scar ran from his left temple down to his jaw, pale against his tanned skin. But it was his eyes that held her attention, grey as winter sky, and just as careful. "Yes," she managed, "I'm Clara Weston. I'm looking for Thomas Brennan." Something shifted in those grey eyes. Not surprise, exactly. More like the quiet bracing a man does before delivering bad news he's been carrying too long. "I'm Luke Carver. Thomas was my friend." He took off his hat, held it against his chest. "I'm sorry to tell you this, ma'am, but Thomas passed 3 days ago. Mining accident up at the Silver Creek shaft. A support beam gave way." The words reached Clara from somewhere far away. She heard them, understood their meaning, but couldn't quite make them connect to the reality she'd been traveling toward for 6 weeks. Thomas Brennan was dead. The man she'd agreed to marry, whose letters had been kind if not poetic, who'd promised her a home and safety in exchange for companionship and partnership, he was gone. She should cry. That would be the proper response. But Clara found she had no tears for a man she'd never met. What she felt instead was a creeping numbness, the cold certainty that she had nowhere to go and no way to get there. "I see," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. Flat, empty. "Thank you for telling me." Luke Carver studied her face, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he saw more than she wanted to show. "You came a long way," he said quietly. "I expect you're tired. Why don't you come inside, get some water, maybe something to eat? We can figure out what comes next." What comes next? As if there were options, as if she weren't stranded in a wilderness that cared nothing for her circumstances, but she followed him into the trading post because there was nothing else to do. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco, coffee, and leather. A few men sat at a rough-hewn table in the corner, playing cards and nursing cups of what looked like whiskey. They glanced up when she entered, took in her dusty dress, and lost expression, then returned to their game with the studied indifference of men who'd learned not to get involved in other people's misfortunes. Luke guided her to a chair near the pot-bellied stove and brought her a tin cup of water. She drank it without tasting it, staring at nothing while her mind tried and failed to plan a future that had just collapsed. "Thomas talked about you," Luke said, pulling up a chair across from her. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a photograph, creased and worn at the edges. "He kept this. Had me take it down in town last month. Said he wanted you to know what he looked like before you got here." Clara took the photograph with numb fingers. The man in the image was perhaps 40, with a full beard and kind eyes. He wore his best clothes. She could tell by the stiff collar and the careful way he held himself. He looked like a man trying to make a good impression, even through the medium of a photograph. "He was a good man," Luke continued. "Honest, hard-working. He talked about you coming like other men talk about striking gold. Made plans for the cabin, wanted to add on a room before winter. He was," Luke paused, choosing his words, "he was happy, thinking about having someone to share his life with." Now the tears came, but not for the reasons Luke probably thought. Clara wept because this good, honest man had died alone, still hoping for the companionship she'd agreed to provide. She wept because she'd never loved him, and now never would. She wept because she was alone in a place that had no use for a woman with no money, no skills, and no prospects. Luke let her cry without trying to comfort her with empty words. When she finally stopped, he handed her a clean handkerchief, worn soft from many washings, but carefully mended. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know." The admission felt like defeat. "I have no money for passage back east, and even if I did—" She stopped, unable to explain that there was nothing back there for her either. No family, no friends. Just the textile mill where she'd worked 14 hours a day, breathing lint and watching her youth disappear into someone else's profit. Luke was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands. They were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd done hard work his entire life. When he looked up, something had been decided behind those careful grey eyes. "Thomas's cabin is empty now," he said. "It's small, but it's sound. Has a good roof, keeps out the weather. My place is about a mile up the mountain. I could—" He paused, seemed to be working out the words. "You could stay at Thomas's place through the winter. I'd check on you, make sure you had wood and provisions. Come spring, if you wanted to head back east or down to one of the towns, I'd help you get there, but you'd be safe through the cold months. You'd have time to figure things out." Clara stared at him. "Why would you do that?" "Because Thomas would have wanted someone to look after you, and because—" Luke met her eyes, and she saw something in them she recognized. Loneliness. The kind that came from too many years of being alone, whether by choice or circumstance. "Because it's the right thing to do." She should refuse, should tell him she couldn't accept charity from a stranger. But winter was coming, and she had no cards left to play. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Luke nodded once, as if they'd just concluded a business arrangement. "We'll head up tomorrow morning if you're able. It's a couple hours' ride. I've got a mule that can carry your things." That night, Clara slept in a room above the trading post, on a bed that felt impossibly soft after weeks of travel. She lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new country, wind in the pines, the distant call of some night bird, the creak of the building settling. She thought about the photograph in her carpet bag, the face of the man she'd traveled so far to marry. She thought about Luke Carver's scarred face and careful words, the way he'd offered help without expectation. And she wondered what kind of life she'd stumbled into, here at the edge of the world where winter was coming and she had nowhere else to go. Outside her window, the mountains stood dark against the stars, ancient and indifferent to the small human dramas playing out in their shadow. Come morning, she would ride up into those mountains with a stranger who'd promised her nothing but shelter and time. It would have to be enough. It was all she had. The morning came cold and clear, with frost turning the world silver. Clara woke before dawn, dressed in the dim light, and packed her few belongings. The wedding dress lay folded at the bottom of her carpet bag, white silk that had cost her 3 months' wages. She'd imagined wearing it in a simple ceremony, Thomas Brennan looking at her with approval if not love. Now it was just another weight to carry. Luke was waiting outside with 2 horses and a sturdy mule loaded with supplies. He helped her mount without fuss, his hands steady and impersonal. They rode out as the sun broke over the eastern peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that Clara had never seen in the smoke-darkened skies of Philadelphia. The trail climbed steadily into country that grew wilder with every mile. Pines crowded close, their branches heavy with the promise of snow. Luke rode ahead, silent but attentive, glancing back now and then to make sure she was managing. Clara clung to the saddle and tried not to think about how far they were traveling from anything resembling civilization. After 2 hours, they emerged into a clearing where a cabin stood against the mountainside. It was smaller than Clara had imagined, built of hewn logs with a stone chimney and a single window facing south. A small barn stood nearby, and beyond it a creek ran clear over smooth stones. The land around had been partially cleared, stumps showing where Thomas had begun the work of making a homestead. "This was Thomas's place," Luke said, dismounting. "Mine's about a mile further up through those trees." He pointed to a path that disappeared into the forest. "I'll get you settled, make sure everything's working proper." Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. One room serving as kitchen, living space, and bedroom. A cast-iron stove dominated one corner, a narrow bed another. A table and 2 chairs, a few shelves holding tin plates and cups, a trunk that likely contained Thomas's belongings. The floor was swept, the windows clean. Someone, Luke, she realized, had prepared the place for her arrival. "I'll show you how the stove works," Luke said, already moving toward it. "Wood goes in here, and you've got to manage the draft or you'll smoke yourself out. There's a root cellar out back, stocked for winter. Thomas planned well. You've got dried beans, flour, salt pork, preserves. Enough to see you through if you're careful." Clara watched him demonstrate the stove, explaining the peculiarities of the draft and the best way to bank a fire for the night. His hands moved with practiced certainty, and she found herself noticing details, the way his shoulders filled his jacket, the careful way he explained things as if teaching mattered to him. "The creek's close for water, but it'll freeze come deep winter," he continued. "There's a barrel by the door for melting snow. The privy's out back, and the barn has 2 chickens and a milk cow. They'll need tending daily. I'll show you how." The day passed in a blur of instruction. Luke showed her how to milk the cow, how to collect eggs, how to split kindling and stack wood for easy reach. He demonstrated everything twice, patiently, and then watched while she tried. Her hands were clumsy, unused to this kind of work, but he didn't criticize, just guided her when she faltered and nodded when she got something right. By afternoon, Clara's head spun with information, and her hands ached from unfamiliar labor. Luke built up the fire, made coffee, and set out bread and cheese from his saddlebag. "You'll want to check the animals morning and evening," he said. "Keep the fire going, it's your life up here. I'll come by day after tomorrow, bring more supplies, see how you're managing." "Mr. Carver," Clara said, and her voice sounded small in the quiet cabin. "I don't know how to do any of this. I worked in a textile mill. I can operate a loom, but I can't." She gestured helplessly at the cabin, the stove, the foreign landscape beyond the window. Luke studied her for a long moment. "You'll learn. Most things worth knowing aren't complicated, just unfamiliar. You seem like someone who pays attention. That's what matters up here, paying attention and not giving up when things get hard." After he left, the silence pressed in like a physical thing. Clara stood in the middle of the cabin, listening to the wind in the pines and the creak of the building settling, and felt the full weight of her isolation. She was alone on a mountain, in a dead man's cabin, dependent on the kindness of a stranger who had no reason to help her beyond some obligation to a friend's memory. She made herself busy checking the animals, bringing in more wood, familiarizing herself with the limited supplies in the root cellar. As evening fell, she managed to get the stove working and heated water for washing. She found Thomas's belongings in the trunk, work clothes, a few books, a small Bible with his name written inside, and at the bottom, a tin box. Inside the box was a Congressional Medal of Honor. Clara lifted it carefully, the heavy metal cold in her palm. The ribbon was faded, the medal itself tarnished. It wasn't Thomas's, his name wasn't on it. She turned it over and found an inscription. Corporal Luke Carver. For valor above and beyond the call of duty, Antietam Creek. September 1862. She sat on the bed, holding the medal, understanding suddenly why Luke moved the way he did. Careful, controlled, like a man who'd learned to live with violence and chosen to leave it behind. The scar on his face made sense now. The quietness that seemed less like shyness and more like hard-won peace. Thomas had kept this medal, which meant Luke had given it to him. Or maybe Thomas had found it and kept it safe. Either way, it spoke to a friendship that ran deeper than casual acquaintance. It meant Luke's offer to help her wasn't just about obligation. It was about honoring a bond that death hadn't broken. Clara returned the medal to its box, placed it back in the trunk. Some things were private, meant to be left alone unless offered. But knowing what Luke had survived, what he'd earned and then walked away from, changed how she saw him. The mountain man who'd offered her shelter had once been a soldier who'd seen the worst humanity could offer. That night, she lay in Thomas's bed, wrapped in quilts that still held the faint scent of wood smoke and pine, and listened to the mountains settle into darkness. A pack of wolves howled in the distance, their voices rising and falling like a conversation in a language older than words. The sound should have terrified her, and it did, but it also reminded her that she was part of something larger now. A world that operated by rules she didn't yet understand. Sleep came fitfully, full of dreams she couldn't quite remember come morning. When she woke, frost covered the inside of the window, and her breath misted in the cold air. The fire had died to embers. She forced herself out of the warm bed, fumbled with the stove, and eventually coaxed flames back to life. The morning routine took twice as long as it should have. She spilled milk while learning to manage the cow, broke an egg trying to collect them, and nearly burned the porridge she attempted to make. By the time the sun cleared the eastern peaks, she was exhausted and close to tears. But the cabin was warm. The animals were fed. She had food and shelter. It would have to be enough. 2 days later, as promised, Luke returned. He arrived mid-morning, riding up the trail with saddlebags bulging with supplies. Clara heard him coming and stepped outside, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. Her hair was pinned up haphazardly, her dress stained from cooking mishaps, her hands chapped from washing in cold water. "Morning," Luke said, dismounting. "How are you managing?" "I'm managing," Clara said, and it was almost true. He unloaded the supplies, more flour, dried apples, coffee, a jar of honey. He checked the animals, examined the woodpile, and asked matter-of-fact questions about the stove, the water, her sleeping arrangements. His presence filled the cabin with a comfortable competence that made Clara realize how uncertain she'd been alone. "I brought something else," he said, pulling a rifle from his saddle. "You'll need to learn to shoot. There's wolves up here, and sometimes bears if they haven't denned up yet. I don't say it to scare you, but you need to be able to protect yourself and the animals." Clara stared at the rifle. I know. That's why I'm going to teach you." He said it simply, as if teaching a city woman to shoot was the most natural thing in the world. They spent the afternoon in a clearing behind the cabin, Luke showing her how to hold the rifle, how to sight down the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze the trigger rather than pull it. The first shot knocked her back a step, the report echoing off the mountains. The second went wide of the target he'd set up, a piece of wood propped against a stump. The third came closer. "You're flinching," Luke said, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him against the autumn chill. "You're anticipating the kick. Don't think about what happens after you pull the trigger. Just focus on the target and let everything else take care of itself." His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steadying her. His voice was calm, patient. Clara tried again, forcing herself to stay relaxed, to trust the process he'd taught her. The shot cracked out, and the piece of wood jumped. "There," Luke said, and she heard the approval in his voice. "You're learning." By the time he left that evening, Clara felt marginally more capable. She could shoot, at least well enough to scare off a predator if she had to. She understood the rhythm of the cabin, the needs of the animals, the management of fire and food and water. She was still frightened, still uncertain, but she was learning. "I'll be back in a few days," Luke said as he prepared to leave. "First snow's coming soon. You'll smell it in the air before it arrives. Kind of a clean, cold scent. When that happens, make sure you've got plenty of wood stacked close and the animals are secure." "Luke," Clara said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. He turned, waiting. "Why are you doing this?" "Really?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking past her toward the mountains turning gold in the sunset. "Because Thomas would have done it for me if our positions were reversed. And because," he paused, choosing words, "because everyone deserves someone to look out for them. You came all this way hoping for that. Seems wrong to let you fall just because circumstances changed." After he rode away, Clara stood outside watching until he disappeared into the trees. The temperature was dropping fast, the way it did in the mountains when the sun went down. She went inside, built up the fire, and sat at the table with a cup of coffee, thinking about the medal in the trunk and the man who'd earned it. Luke Carver was more than he appeared. A soldier who'd become a hermit, a fighter who'd chosen gentleness, a man alone who still understood the value of looking after others. He confused her, this quiet mountain man with careful hands and patient words. But he also steadied her in ways she hadn't expected. 3 days later, the first snow came. Clara woke to a world transformed. White covered everything, the clearing, the woodpile, the roof of the barn. The silence was profound, as if the snow had muffled not just sound, but time itself. She stood at the window, coffee cup warming her hands, and watched the flakes drift down in the pale morning light. The routine she'd established over 3 weeks sustained her now. She dressed warmly, tended the animals, managed the fire, prepared simple meals. Her hands had toughened, the blisters becoming calluses. She could split kindling without fear of the axe, could milk the cow without spilling half of it, could cook porridge that didn't stick to the pot. Small victories, but they mattered. Luke came every few days, always with supplies, always checking on her welfare with quiet thoroughness. He'd repaired a loose board on the barn, reinforced the chicken coop against predators, showed her how to render fat for candles and soap. Each visit brought new knowledge, new skills she absorbed, like someone learning a foreign language through immersion. She'd started keeping a journal, writing by firelight in the evenings. The leather-bound book had been a gift from the mill supervisor's wife back in Philadelphia, given when Clara announced she was leaving. "So you can remember where you came from," the woman had said, though Clara suspected she meant it as a warning against forgetting her place. Now Clara wrote about different things: the way the morning light struck the peaks, the satisfaction of collecting warm eggs from beneath broody hens, the precise blue of the sky before a storm. And increasingly, she wrote about Luke, his patient instruction, his quiet competence, the way he moved through the world with deliberate care. One afternoon, he arrived with a young pine tree tied to his saddle. "For Christmas," he said, as if this explained everything. "Thought you might want something to mark the season." Clara hadn't realized Christmas was approaching. Time moved differently up here, measured not in calendar dates, but in the rhythm of survival: morning chores, afternoon wood splitting, evening meals, sleep. But Luke was right. December had come while she wasn't paying attention. They set the tree in a bucket of stones near the window. Luke produced a small bag of dried cranberries and showed her how to string them with thread, creating simple garland. They worked in comfortable silence, and Clara found herself studying his hands, scarred, capable, surprisingly gentle when handling the delicate berries. "Tell me about before," she said suddenly. "Before you came to the mountains." Luke's hands stilled. He didn't look at her, just kept threading cranberries with careful focus. "That's a long story. We have time." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then slowly he began to talk, about growing up on a farm in Ohio, joining the army when war came, rising through the ranks, not because he sought glory, but because men followed him naturally. He spoke of Antietam Creek, where the medal came from, though he didn't mention the medal itself. He described the fighting with detached precision, as if speaking about events that happened to someone else. I was good at war, he said, and there was no pride in his voice. That bothered me more than anything else. I could make decisions that sent men to die, and I could sleep afterward. That's not something a man should be good at. But you earned that medal, Clara said carefully. That means you saved lives, didn't you? Saved some, lost others. The medal doesn't account for the balance. He finished the garland, set it aside. When the war ended, I came west. Wanted to be somewhere I couldn't hurt anyone anymore. Thomas found me in a bad way. Winter of '67, I'd been drinking, trying to forget. He sobered me up, gave me work, became the closest thing I had to family. That's why, he gestured vaguely toward Clara, the cabin, the mountain. That's why I couldn't leave you stranded. Clara understood then that Luke's kindness wasn't simple charity. It was redemption, the kind a man earns slowly through small acts repeated daily. Every time he checked on her, taught her something new, made sure she was safe, he was balancing some internal ledger only he could see. My mother died when I was 12, Clara offered, trading confidence for confidence. Fever took her in 3 days. My father remarried within the year. His new wife, she wasn't cruel exactly, just indifferent. I was something to be fed and housed until I was old enough to work. When I turned 16, I went to the mill. 14 hours a day, 6 days a week, breathing cotton dust and watching the machines eat girls' fingers if they weren't careful. Luke's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Just listened. I was invisible there, Clara continued. One of dozens of girls doing the same work, living in the same boarding house, eating the same grey food. When I saw Thomas's advertisement for a mail-order bride, I answered because I thought, she paused, searching for honesty. I thought anything would be better than disappearing into that life completely. Even marrying a stranger seemed like a chance at something real. And now, Luke asked quietly. Clara looked around the cabin, small, isolated, demanding in ways she'd never imagined. Then she looked at Luke, at his scarred face and careful eyes, and felt something shift inside her chest. Now I think maybe I found something real after all. Just not the way I expected. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning neither was quite ready to examine. Luke stood abruptly, moved to the door. I should check the animals before I head back. But he didn't leave immediately. Instead, he turned back, and Clara saw something in his expression she hadn't noticed before, loneliness so profound it had worn grooves in his soul. This cabin, he said, it's felt less empty since you came. I just wanted you to know that. Then he was gone, out into the cold afternoon, leaving Clara standing alone with her racing heart and the smell of pine filling the small space. That evening, she wrote in her journal by firelight, I think I'm beginning to understand what it means to belong somewhere. Not because the place wants you, but because you choose to want it back. And maybe that's true of people too. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow and bitter cold. Clara had been making small preparations, baking bread, using precious sugar to make dried apple pie, knitting a scarf from yarn she'd unraveled from an old sweater. She told herself it was just to mark the holiday, but she knew she was really hoping Luke would visit. He came in the afternoon, and Clara's heart lifted absurdly at the sight of him trudging through the snow. He carried something wrapped in oilcloth, held it carefully as he stamped snow from his boots on the porch. "Merry Christmas," he said, handing her the package. Inside was a wooden spoon, carved from pale wood and polished smooth. The handle was decorated with an intricate pattern of vines and leaves, each detail perfect. It must have taken him hours, maybe days. "Luke," Clara breathed. "It's beautiful. Figured you could use one. The tin spoons are rough on the pots." He said it matter-of-factly, but she saw color rise in his weathered cheeks. "I made something for you, too." She retrieved the scarf, suddenly uncertain. "It's not much." He took it like she'd handed him something precious. Unfolded it, ran his fingers over the uneven stitches, then wrapped it around his neck. "It's perfect. No one's made me anything in—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Thank you." They shared the Christmas meal, simple but carefully prepared. The cabin glowed with firelight and candle flame. The pine tree stood decorated with cranberry garland and a few paper ornaments Clara had folded. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in white silence. After dinner, they sat by the fire, not speaking much, but comfortable in the quiet. Clara turned the wooden spoon in her hands, marveling at the craftsmanship. "You have real skill," she said. "Just practice." "I've got a lot of evening hours to fill." He paused. I had a lot of evening hours to fill. The implication wasn't lost on Clara. She looked at him across the firelight. This man who'd survived war in solitude, who'd chosen gentleness when violence would have been easier, who'd taken in a desperate stranger because his conscience wouldn't let him do otherwise. "Luke," she said softly, "may I ask you something?" He nodded, his grey eyes steady on hers. "That first day, when you offered to help me, did you think I'd stay? Or did you think I'd leave come spring?" He took a long time answering. "Honest truth, I didn't think much past getting you through winter. Figured spring would sort itself out." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "But somewhere along the way I started hoping you'd stay. Is that wrong of me?" Clara's breath caught. "No, it's not wrong." They sat in the charged silence, the space between them suddenly full of possibility. Luke stood, moved toward her, and Clara rose to meet him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, close enough that she could see the silver threading through his dark hair, the exact pattern of the scar across his face, the vulnerability in his eyes. He raised one hand, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek. His palm was warm and rough with calluses. Clara leaned into the touch, and that small movement was all the permission he needed. The kiss was soft, tentative, like a question being asked. Clara answered by pressing closer, her hands finding the solid warmth of his shoulders. The kiss deepened, and she felt years of loneliness beginning to crack apart, letting something new and frightening and wonderful take root. When they finally pulled apart, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, but his hands remained gentle on her waist. "You're vulnerable here, under my protection. I don't want to take advantage." "I'm not a child, Luke." Clara's voice was steady, sure. "I can make my own choices, and I choose this. I choose you. You don't know what you're choosing." He stepped back, and she felt the loss of his warmth. "You don't know me well enough. Then tell me more." "Show me more." She reached for his hand, held it firmly. "I'm not going anywhere. We have all winter." Luke looked at their joined hands, then up at her face, and something in his expression shifted, resolution replacing doubt. "All right," he said quietly. "All right." He didn't kiss her again that night, though the wanting hung palpable in the air between them. Instead, they sat by the fire talking until the candles burned low, sharing stories and silences, building something more substantial than attraction. Luke told her about the cabin he'd built with his own hands, about the first winter alone when he'd nearly given up, about Thomas finding him and giving him reason to keep going. Clara told him about the mill, about watching other girls her age marry and have children while she remained invisible, about the fear that she'd disappear entirely if she didn't take some desperate chance at change. When Luke finally rose to leave, Clara walked him to the door. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant against the black sky. "Tomorrow?" she asked. "Tomorrow," he promised. She watched him disappear into the darkness, then closed the door and leaned against it, holding the wooden spoon to her chest. The cabin felt different now, not empty or borrowed, but hers. Theirs, perhaps, if she was brave enough to believe in possibilities. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I think I'm learning what it means to be chosen. Not for what I can provide or what I represent, but for who I am. And I think I'm learning to choose back. It's terrifying and wonderful all at once." January brought cold that cut like broken glass. The kind of cold that made your lungs ache with each breath, that turned water to ice within minutes of being drawn from the creek. Clara learned to manage it through layers, wool and flannel and leather, everything she owned worn at once when she went outside to tend the animals. Luke came more often now, or perhaps it only seemed that way because each visit carried new weight. They didn't speak again about the kiss, but it lived between them in every glance, every accidental touch, every loaded silence. Clara found herself watching him work, The way his hands moved with such certainty, the way he explained things with infinite patience, the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't noticing. She was noticing everything now. One morning she discovered a small wooden box on her porch, no note or explanation. Inside was a silver thimble and several spools of thread, practical gifts, but she understood the message. Luke was thinking about her, noticing what she might need. The gesture warmed her more than any passionate declaration might have. She kept the thimble in her pocket, touching it sometimes when the loneliness pressed in. A reminder that someone knew she existed, that her comfort mattered to another human soul. The days developed a rhythm. Morning chores, then time for her own pursuits. Mending clothes, reading from Thomas's small library, writing in her journal. Afternoon brought more wood splitting, more cooking, more of the endless work required to simply stay alive in this country. Evenings she spent by the fire, sometimes reading aloud to the empty room. Sometimes just listening to the wind and thinking about the mountain man who'd somehow become the center of her world. When Luke visited, they worked side by side on whatever needed doing. He showed her how to repair leather harnesses, how to sharpen knives properly, how to recognize the signs of illness in the animals. She showed him the bread she'd learned to bake, the quilt she was piecing together from scraps, the way she'd organized the cabin to make it more efficient. "You've made it a home," he said one afternoon, looking around with what might have been wistfulness. "Thomas would have liked that. Do you like it?" Clara asked and held her breath for the answer. "I do." He met her eyes, and something passed between them. "I like it very much." The almost kiss moments multiplied, reaching for the same tool and finding their hands touching, standing close while he showed her something, close enough to feel the heat of him. Saying goodnight at the door, lingering too long, wanting and not quite daring. Clara began to wonder if Luke was waiting for something, some sign from her, some certainty that she wouldn't regret choosing him. She'd said she chose him, but words were easy. Maybe he needed more than words. One evening, she worked up her courage as he prepared to leave. "Stay for supper," she said. "It's late already, and I made stew." He hesitated, and she saw the war in his eyes, wanting to stay, fearing what staying might mean. "I shouldn't." "Why not?" Clara stepped closer. "Because people might talk." "There's no one to talk up here." "Because it's not proper?" "I stopped caring about proper when I climbed on a stagecoach to marry a stranger." "Or is it because you're afraid?" The direct challenge sparked something in his grey eyes. "Maybe I'm afraid." "You should be too. You don't know what you're asking for." "Then show me." She reached for his hand, held it between both of hers. "Stay, share a meal. Talk with me. If that's all that happens, that's all that happens. But stop deciding for me what I can and can't handle." Luke studied their joined hands, then her face, and slowly nodded. "All right." They ate stew and cornbread at the small table, talking about ordinary things, the weather, the animals, plans for spring planting. But underneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of electricity, awareness, possibility. When Clara stood to clear the dishes, Luke stood too, and suddenly they were too close, breathing the same air. "Clara," he said, and her name in his rough voice sent shivers down her spine. "Yes, I need you to be sure." "About this." "About me?" She set down the dishes and turned to face him fully. "I'm sure." "I've never been more sure of anything." This kiss was different from the first. Where Christmas Eve had been tentative and questioning, this was certain and claiming. Luke pulled her close, one hand tangling in her hair, the other pressing against the small of her back. Clara wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him back with all the loneliness and longing she'd been carrying since Philadelphia. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to rush you," he said. "You're not. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing you. Every moment, I'm choosing you." They stood together in the firelight, holding each other, and Clara felt something settle deep in her chest. Not the wild excitement of new romance, but something steadier and more profound. Safety, belonging, home. Luke didn't leave that night. They sat by the fire talking until the candles burned down and the logs collapsed into coals. Then Clara led him to the bed, Thomas's bed that had become hers and would now become theirs, and they lay down together fully clothed, simply holding each other in the darkness. "Tell me something true," Clara whispered. "This cabin has felt less like a prison and more like a refuge since you came. Tell me something else. I didn't know I could still feel this way. Didn't think I deserved to." Clara turned to face him, found his face in the darkness by touch. "You deserve this. You deserve to be happy. So do you." His hand cupped her cheek. "That's what I keep trying to tell you. You deserve more than a scarred-up mountain hermit who barely knows how to live among people anymore. I deserve someone who's kind, someone patient, someone who sees me as more than a burden or a convenience. Someone who carves me wooden spoons and teaches me to shoot and makes sure I have enough firewood." She kissed him softly. "I deserve you, Luke Carver. And you deserve me." He pulled her close, buried his face in her hair, and she felt the shudder that ran through him, relief or release, or both. They fell asleep tangled together, warm beneath the quilts, the wind howling outside but unable to touch them. When Clara woke in the grey pre-dawn, Luke was still there, solid and real beside her. She watched him sleep, this man who'd survived war and emerged choosing gentleness, who'd lost his way and found it again in these mountains, who'd taken in a desperate stranger and somehow found his own salvation in the process. She understood now what people meant when they talked about love. Not the passionate declarations or grand gestures she'd read about in books, but this quiet certainty, this willingness to build something slowly, day by day, choice by choice. This recognition of another person's worth and the decision to honor it. Luke's eyes opened, found her watching him. He smiled, and it transformed his face, made him younger, lighter, less burdened by history. "Morning," he said. "Morning. Any regrets?" "None. You?" "None." He touched her face gently. "But we should probably talk about what happens next." "What do you want to happen next?" Luke considered the question seriously. "I want you to stay, not just through winter but permanently. I want to marry you properly when we can get to a preacher. I want to add that room onto the cabin like Thomas planned. I want to build a life here with you." He paused. "But I also want you to be free to choose something else, if that's what you need." Clara took his hand, pressed it over her heart so he could feel it beating. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose building something real, even if it's hard. Especially because it's hard." "Then let's do that," Luke said simply. "Let's build something real." Outside, the sun broke over the eastern peaks, flooding the cabin with golden light. A new day beginning, a new life taking shape. Two people who'd been lost finding their way back to something that mattered. February arrived with deceptive gentleness, a few days of warming that made the snow turn heavy and wet. Luke moved most of his belongings down from his cabin, settling into the space Clara had already made home. They established new routines, cooking together, reading aloud in the evenings, sharing the bed each night with growing comfort and deepening intimacy. But despite the closeness, despite the promises made, something remained unresolved between them. Clara sensed it in the way Luke sometimes grew quiet, staring into the fire with an expression she couldn't read. She felt it in his careful distance, even as they grew more familiar, as if he was holding some part of himself back, protecting her from something she didn't yet understand. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Clara noticed Luke reaching into his shirt pocket and withdrawing something, a gesture she'd seen him make countless times but never questioned. This time she reached out and gently caught his wrist. "What is that?" she asked softly. Luke's hand tightened protectively around whatever he held, then slowly opened. On his palm lay a small bundle of letters tied with string, the edges worn from much handling. "These are from Thomas," Luke said quietly. "He wrote them to you before he died. But he never got the chance to send them." Clara stared at the letters, her heart contracting. "How long have you had these?" "Since the day after the accident. I went through his things, looking for information about his family, anyone who should be notified. Found these instead." Luke set them on the table between them. "I should have given them to you sooner. I wasn't sure if it would help or hurt." Clara picked up the bundle with trembling fingers. 6 letters, each addressed to Miss Clara Weston in careful, steady handwriting. She looked at Luke, seeking permission or perhaps strength. "Read them," he said. "It's all right. I've already read them. Thomas wouldn't have minded. He had no secrets from me." Clara untied the string and opened the first letter. Thomas's voice came through clearly in the simple, honest prose. He wrote about his anticipation of her arrival, his hopes for their life together, his awareness that she might find the mountain harsh and lonely at first. He promised to be patient, to give her time to adjust, to do everything in his power to make her comfortable and happy. The second letter described the cabin and the land, the work he'd done and the improvements he planned. He wrote about Luke, my truest friend, the best man I've ever known, though he doesn't see it in himself. "If anything should happen to me, Clara, I know Luke would look after you. He's the kind of man who keeps his word even when it costs him." Tears blurred Clara's vision as she read the third letter. Thomas expressed hope that she would come to care for him, even if she couldn't love him at first. "I know I'm not much to look at and I'm twice your age, but I promise I'll be good to you. You'll never want for anything I can provide. And maybe, in time, you'll find contentment here. That's all I ask, contentment." The fourth letter was shorter, written the week before his death. "The mine work is dangerous, but the pay is good. I want to have enough saved before you arrive to make the cabin proper for a lady. Luke tells me I'm working too hard, but he doesn't understand how it feels to have something good coming after so many years of being alone. I keep thinking about you stepping off that stage and how I'll finally have someone to come home to, someone to build a life with." The fifth letter was dated 3 days before the accident. "Clara, I had Luke take a photograph of me today. I wanted you to see my face before you arrived, so you wouldn't be disappointed. I know I'm rough-looking, but I promise there's kindness in me. Luke says I worry too much, that any woman brave enough to come west alone is brave enough to see past appearances. I hope he's right." The final letter was the longest, written the night before Thomas died. Clara read it through tears that wouldn't stop falling. "Clara, by the time you read this, you'll be here, and I'll have met you face to face. I'll know whether you found the journey too hard, whether the cabin disappointed you, whether I disappointed you. But tonight, not knowing yet, I want to tell you that I'm grateful. Grateful that you answered my advertisement, that you were brave enough to take this chance. Whatever happens between us, I want you to know that just the hope of you coming has made this past year bearable. I've worked hard to make a place worthy of you. If I've succeeded, then we'll build a good life together. If I've failed, if you find you can't stay, then at least I'll have tried to give you something better than what you left behind. Either way, thank you for giving an old miner hope. And if you're reading this years from now, when we're old together, I hope you'll remember this night when I wrote these words and knew that love doesn't always start with passion. Sometimes it starts with hope and builds into something real through patience and care. That's what I want for us, Clara, something real and lasting. Your intended husband, Thomas Brennan." Clara set down the final letter, unable to see through her tears. She felt Luke's hand on her shoulder, steady and comforting. "He was a good man," Luke said quietly. "One of the best I've known. He would have been good to you. You would have been safe with him. I know." Clara wiped at her tears. "That makes it harder somehow. That he died waiting for something he wanted so much. He died happy," Luke said firmly. "The last time I saw him, the day before the accident, he talked about you coming. His whole face lit up. He had hope, Clara. That's more than most people get." Clara turned to Luke, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. "You loved him, like a brother." "Yes." Luke's voice was rough with emotion. "He saved my life. Not dramatically. He just refused to let me give up when giving up would have been easier. He saw something in me worth salvaging when I'd stopped seeing it myself." "Is that why you're with me?" Clara asked, needing to know. "Because you're trying to fulfill Thomas's dream? Because you feel obligated to give me the life he wanted to give me?" Luke's eyes widened, and he gripped her shoulders firmly. "No, that's not Clara, listen to me. Yes, I took you in because of Thomas. Yes, I felt obligated to honor his wishes. But what I feel for you now has nothing to do with obligation. You're not Thomas's dream I'm trying to fulfill. You're your own person, and it's you I want, not some idea of what you represent. How can you be sure? Clara's voice was small. How can I be sure? Maybe we're both just trying to make something good come from his death. Maybe we're building on grief instead of love. Luke was quiet for a long moment, thinking. Then he stood and went to the door, opened it despite the cold, and pointed up the mountain toward where his cabin stood, dark and empty. I built that cabin 7 years ago, he said. After Thomas helped me get sober, helped me see I had something left to live for. I built it as a refuge, a place to hide from the world and from myself. I lived there alone, convinced that was my lot, that I'd used up all my chances at anything better. When Thomas told me about you coming, I was happy for him. He deserved companionship. But I didn't think about it for myself. Didn't let myself think about it. He closed the door, came back to stand before her. Then you arrived, and Thomas was gone, and I found myself responsible for someone who needed help. For the first few weeks, that's all it was, responsibility, making sure you survived the winter. But then he stopped, searching for words. Then you started learning, started becoming part of this place, started looking at me like I was something more than a scarred hermit doing his duty. And I realized the cabin felt different. I felt different. Not because I was fulfilling Thomas's wishes, but because you made me want things I'd stopped wanting years ago. What things? Clara whispered. Partnership, conversation, laughter, a reason to come home that wasn't just avoiding the world. You gave me that, Clara, not because you're Thomas's intended or because you need protection, but because of who you are. The way you face fear and keep going. The way you learn and adapt. The way you see the world with clear eyes and still choose to find beauty in it. He knelt beside her chair, took her hands in his. I love you. Not because I love Thomas, but because I've come to know you, and you're worth loving. Clara looked at him through her tears, at this man who'd survived so much and come out the other side still capable of such fierce, honest emotion. I love you too, she said. And you're right. I needed to hear you say it wasn't about Thomas. I needed to know this is real. It's real. Luke pulled her into his arms, held her tight. Whatever we build from here, it's ours. Not Thomas's dream or anyone else's expectations. Just ours. They held each other while the fire burned low and the wind rattled the windows. Outside, the world was frozen and harsh. Inside, two people found warmth in choosing each other, fully and without reservation. Later, as they prepared for bed, Clara gathered the letters carefully and placed them in the trunk with Thomas's other belongings. We should bury these with him come spring, she said. When the ground thaws. He wrote them for me, but they should rest with him. He'd like that, Luke agreed. He'd like knowing you read them. That you understand what kind of man he was. I do understand, and I'm grateful to him. He brought me here. He gave you reason to help me. In a way, he gave us both what we needed, even if it wasn't in the way he planned. That night, Clara lay in Luke's arms, thinking about the strange paths that lead people to where they need to be. Thomas had died, and that was tragic. But his death had brought her and Luke together, and they'd built something real from grief and circumstance. Not a replacement for what Thomas had hoped for, but something genuine and chosen. She thought about Thomas's words. Sometimes love starts with hope and builds into something real through patience and care. He'd been writing about what he wanted with her, but the words applied just as well to what she'd found with Luke. Thank you, Thomas, she whispered into the darkness, for bringing me here, for trusting Luke to look after me, for helping him survive long enough to find me. Beside her, Luke's arms tightened and she knew he'd heard. Knew he was silently thanking his friend too, for the gift they'd both been given through his absence. In the morning, they would continue building their life together. But tonight, they honored the man whose hope had set everything in motion, and whose friendship had shaped the man Clara had come to love. The last weeks of February brought longer days and the promise of eventual thaw. Clara noticed Luke spending more time in the barn, working on something he kept covered with an old tarp. When she asked about it, he'd only smile and tell her she'd see when it was finished. Her curiosity got the better of her one afternoon when Luke was down at the creek checking the ice. She slipped into the barn, lifted the corner of the tarp and caught her breath. It was a headboard for a bed, carved from golden pine and already partially finished. The design was intricate, roses and vines intertwining in an elegant pattern that must have taken countless hours. Some sections were complete, the wood polished to a soft sheen. Others showed only rough outlines, waiting to be refined. "It's beautiful," Clara said when Luke returned and found her standing in the barn, the tarp pulled back. He'd looked embarrassed, like she'd caught him at something private. "I started it years ago," he admitted. "When I first built my cabin, thought maybe someday I'd have someone to share it with. Got halfway through and realized I was being foolish. Put it away and tried to forget about it." Clara traced one of the carved roses with her finger, feeling the smoothness of the wood. "Why did you start working on it again?" "Because you made me believe in someday again." He came to stand beside her. "Figured if we're going to build a life together, we might as well build it properly. With things that last, things that show permanence and intention. Can I help?" Clara asked. "I don't know anything about carving, but I could learn." Luke's face softened. "I'd like that." So they began spending afternoons in the barn when the weather allowed, working on the headboard together. Luke taught her to use the carving tools, how to follow the grain of the wood, how to apply the right amount of pressure to create smooth lines rather than gouges. Her first attempts were clumsy, but he was patient, guiding her hands, showing her again and again, until she started to get the feel of it. They talked while they worked, the kind of deep conversation that comes when hands are busy and the mind is free to wander. Luke told her about his childhood on the Ohio farm, about parents who'd been strict but loving, about siblings he'd lost touch with during the war years. He wondered sometimes if they'd tried to find him, if they knew he'd survived. Clara told him about growing up with a stepmother who'd never been cruel, but had never been warm either. About feeling like an intruder in her own home, always trying to make herself small and useful and unobtrusive. About the relief of leaving for the mill, and the slow realization that she'd traded one kind of invisibility for another. "You're not invisible now," Luke said, his hand covering hers on the carving knife. "I see you, Clara, every part of you." "I know," she said softly. "And that's what terrifies me sometimes. Being truly seen means being truly vulnerable. Does it feel like I'll hurt you? Take advantage of that vulnerability?" Clara considered the question seriously. "No, but old fears don't always listen to reason. I spent so many years believing I wasn't worth seeing that sometimes I don't know how to accept that I am." Luke set down his tools and turned to face her fully. "Then let me tell you what I see. I see a woman who traveled across a continent to take a chance on a better life, who faced devastating news with dignity and made the best of impossible circumstances, who learned skills in weeks that take most people years, who's brave and stubborn and kind and funny, who reads poetry aloud to chickens when she thinks no one's listening, who makes the cabin feel like home just by being in it." Clara laughed through the tears suddenly filling her eyes. "You've heard me reading to the chickens." "More than once," he smiled, brushing tears from her cheek. "It's one of my favorite things about you, the way you treat everything with care, even hens that can't appreciate Shakespeare." "I don't know how to be loved," Clara whispered, the confession torn from somewhere deep. "I never learned. No one ever showed me." Luke cupped her face in both hands, his gray eyes fierce and tender at once. "Then let me show you how. Let me show you every day in every small way I can think of. Not with grand gestures or pretty words, but with patience and attention and care. Let me show you that you're worth coming home to, worth carving headboards for, worth choosing over and over again." Clara kissed him then, pouring into it all the words she couldn't find, gratitude and love and wonder that this man, this beautiful, damaged, healing man, had chosen her just as completely as she'd chosen him. The headboard became their project, a physical manifestation of what they were building together. Each afternoon, they'd work for an hour or two, slowly bringing the design to completion. Luke showed her how to sand the rough edges smooth, how to apply oil that brought out the grain of the wood, how to polish it to a soft glow. "It's like raising a barn," Clara said one afternoon, standing back to admire their progress. The whole community comes together, and at the end of the day there's something solid and real that wasn't there before. Except it's just us, Luke said. Building something that's just ours. I like that, Clara said, just us. Building something real. As March arrived, the headboard neared completion. They worked on the final details together, Clara doing the easier sections while Luke handled the more intricate areas. The roses bloomed across the wood in perfect profusion. The vines twisted and turned with natural grace, and the whole thing seemed to glow with warmth and life. It's finished, Luke said one evening, stepping back to survey their work. Clara stood beside him, their shoulders touching, and felt pride swell in her chest. They'd made this together, not Luke alone and not Clara alone, but both of them working in partnership to create something beautiful and permanent. When should we install it? She asked. Tomorrow, Luke said. And when we do, I want to ask you something proper. Clara's heart fluttered. What kind of something? The kind that deserves a proper answer. He took her hand, threaded their fingers together. But tomorrow, when the headboard's in place and we're standing in front of what we've built together. That night, Clara lay awake long after Luke had fallen asleep, thinking about the headboard waiting in the barn, about the roses carved with such care, about the hours spent working side by side, about the permanence it represented. She thought about Luke's words, "Let me show you how to be loved," and realized he'd been showing her all along, in making sure she had enough firewood, in teaching her to shoot and milk and survive, in bringing her small gifts and speaking to her with respect, in listening when she talked and making space for her fears without dismissing them, in inviting her into his life not as a guest, but as a partner. That was love, she understood now. Not the dramatic passion of storybooks, but the steady choosing of another person's welfare and happiness alongside your own. The commitment to show up day after day and build something real. "I'm ready," she whispered into the darkness. "I'm ready to be loved. I'm ready to love back." Beside her, Luke stirred slightly, and she felt his arm tighten around her waist. Even in sleep, he was choosing her. Tomorrow, she would choose him back in whatever way he asked. And the headboard they'd carved together would stand as testament to what they'd built. Not just a piece of furniture, but a promise carved in wood and polished with care. A symbol of the life they were creating, one careful choice at a time. Morning came with unusual warmth, the kind of false spring day that sometimes arrived in early March before winter's final assault. Clara and Luke worked together to carry the headboard from the barn to the cabin, maneuvering it carefully through the narrow door. They fitted it to the bed frame Luke had built weeks ago, and it settled into place as if it had always belonged there. Clara stepped back, admiring how the carved roses seemed to bloom against the log walls, how the whole cabin felt transformed by this addition. It wasn't just furniture, it was a statement of intention, of permanence, of building rather than merely surviving. Luke stood beside her, his hand finding hers. "Clara Weston," he said, and his voice was steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. "Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because circumstances forced us together, but because we choose each other. Because we've built something real here, and I want to keep building it with you for whatever years we're given." "Yes," Clara said, the word coming without hesitation. "Yes, I'll marry you. I'll keep choosing you. I'll keep building this life with you." Luke pulled her into his arms, and they stood together in the cabin that had become their home, in front of the bed and the headboard they'd created together, and Clara felt a deep sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged. With this man, in this place, building this life. They were still standing there, wrapped in each other and in their own private joy, when they heard the sound of a horse approaching. Luke tensed slightly. Visitors were rare this high up the mountain, and unexpected visitors usually meant trouble. A man dismounted outside, tall and well-dressed in city clothes that looked absurdly out of place in the mountain clearing. He knocked on the door with what sounded like official authority. Luke opened the door, keeping Clara slightly behind him. "Can I help you?" "Luke Carver?" The man consulted a leather folder. I'm Charles Hendricks, representing Continental Mining Company. I'm here regarding your land claim. Clara felt Luke's entire body go rigid. What about my land claim? Hendricks pulled out a document, unfolded it with crisp efficiency. Recent geological surveys have indicated significant mineral deposits beneath your property and the surrounding area. Continental Mining has filed a claim under the Territorial Mining Act of 1866, which grants mining companies rights to mineral extraction on claimed lands under certain conditions. This is my land, Luke said, his voice dangerously quiet. I have a legal deed. Yes, you have surface rights. Hendricks spoke in the tone of someone who'd delivered this speech before. However, the mineral rights fall under territorial jurisdiction when significant deposits are involved. Continental Mining is prepared to offer you a fair buyout, $500 for the property and structures, plus relocation assistance to another parcel of land outside the mining district. Clara stepped forward, anger overriding her usual reticence. You can't just take someone's home. Hendricks barely glanced at her. I'm afraid the law is clear, miss. The company has 30 days to complete the survey and file formal claim. Mr. Carver has 30 days from notification, which is today, to accept the buyout or contest the claim in territorial court. He handed Luke the document. I should mention that contesting rarely succeeds. The territorial government has considerable interest in mining development. It's where the tax revenue comes from. Get off my property, Luke said, each word carefully controlled. Hendricks tipped his hat. I'll be back in 30 days for your answer. I recommend you consider the offer seriously. Mining operations proceed whether you're here or not, and it's considerably more pleasant to be compensated and relocated than to be forced out by legal action. He remounted, then paused. One more thing. There are 11 other properties in this area that received similar notifications today. If you're thinking about organizing resistance, be aware that Continental Mining has significant legal resources and political connections. Good day. They watched him ride away, Clara feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Luke stood frozen, staring at the document in his hands. Luke, Clara touched his arm gently. He turned to her, and she saw in his eyes a devastation that went beyond anger. This land, it's all I have. It's the only place I've ever felt at peace. And Thomas, his voice broke. Thomas died in Continental Mining's Silver Creek shaft. He died making them money, and now they want to take the land we planned our futures on. Clara took the document from his hands, scanned it quickly. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was clear. Continental Mining had the law on their side, and they had resources Luke couldn't match. We'll fight this, she said firmly. With what? I don't have money for lawyers. I barely have money to get through to spring. Then we'll find another way. Clara's mind was already racing, thinking through options. You said 11 other properties were served. That means 11 other families facing the same thing. There's strength in numbers. They'll crush us. Luke's voice was hollow. Mining companies always win. They have the money and the political connections. Men like me, we're just in the way of progress. Clara grabbed his face between her hands, forcing him to look at her. Listen to me. You survived a war. You survived losing yourself and finding your way back. You built this cabin with your own hands and made a life in these mountains. You're not going to roll over and let them take it without a fight. Something flickered in his eyes, not hope exactly, but the ember of fight that hadn't quite been extinguished. What do you suggest? He asked. We go down to the trading post. We find the other families who were served. We talk to them, organize, figure out what our options are together. Clara was surprised by the firmness in her own voice, the certainty. And if we can't win, if the law really is stacked against us, then we negotiate from a position of strength. We make them pay more than $500 for what you've built. We make them provide real relocation assistance. We make them establish worker protections so no more men die in collapsing mine shafts like Thomas did. Luke studied her face, and slowly, something that looked like pride replaced the devastation in his expression. When did you become so fierce? When someone threatened to take away what I love. Clara looked around the cabin. Their cabin, with its carved headboard and hard-won comfort. I didn't come all this way, survive all this, find you, just to let some mining company decide our future without a fight. Luke pulled her close, buried his face in her hair. All right. We'll fight, together. They spent the afternoon preparing. Clara packed supplies while Luke loaded the wagon. They'd go down to the trading post, find the other affected families, and figure out what could be done. It felt impossibly small against the weight of corporate power and territorial law, but it was something. It was better than accepting defeat without even trying. As they prepared to leave, Clara caught sight of the headboard through the open bedroom door. They'd installed it this morning in joy, never imagining that within hours they'd be facing the possible loss of everything they'd built. The roses, carved in the wood, seemed to mock her now, symbols of permanence in a world that had just proven itself impermanent. We'll find a way, Luke said, following her gaze. Even if we lose this cabin, we'll find another place. We'll take the headboard with us. We'll start over. I don't want to start over, Clara said, and heard the stubbornness in her voice. I want to keep what we've built. I want to finish the life we've started here. I do too. Luke took her hand. But Clara, you need to understand. We might not win this. Mining companies have been displacing homesteaders for years. The law favors resource extraction over individual property rights. We might fight with everything we have and still lose. Then we lose fighting, Clara said firmly, but we don't give up before we've even tried. They left the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The mountain that had been their refuge now felt vulnerable, claimed by forces beyond their control. But Clara refused to accept that some corporation hundreds of miles away could simply decide that their home, their life, their carefully built future meant nothing compared to the silver in the ground. At the trading post, they found chaos. 11 families, all served with notification on the same day, all facing the same impossible choice. Some were angry, talking about armed resistance. Others were resigned, already planning where they'd go. A few were simply stunned, unable to process the sudden destruction of everything they'd worked for. Luke and Clara moved through the crowd, listening, talking, slowly building consensus. By evening, they'd organized a meeting for the following night. Everyone would come, they'd pool their knowledge and resources, and they'd figure out together what response was possible. As they rode back up the mountain in the darkness, Clara leaned against Luke's solid warmth and thought about the headboard waiting in their cabin, about the roses they'd carved together, about the permanence they represented, about the future they symbolized. I won't let them take it, she whispered. I won't let them take what we've built. We'll fight, Luke promised, however we can, for as long as we can, together. But as the cabin came into view, dark against the starlit sky, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. This morning they'd been planning a wedding, installing a headboard, building a future. Now they were planning resistance against forces that had crushed better-equipped opponents than them. The mountain was the same, the cabin was the same. But the certainty Clara had felt just hours ago had been replaced by something harder and more determined. If she'd learned anything in her months on this mountain, it was that survival required more than hoping for the best. It required fighting, for what mattered, even when the odds were impossible. Especially when the odds were impossible. The meeting at the trading post the next evening drew not just the 11 affected families, but others from the wider mountain community. Word had spread quickly, and people understood that what threatened Luke and the others could eventually threaten them all. If continental mining could claim mineral rights on established homesteads, no one was safe. Clara stood near the back, watching Luke talk with other men, sharing information and building consensus. She'd never seen him like this, animated, focused, taking charge in a way that reminded her he'd once been a military leader. Men listened when he spoke, trusted his judgment, followed his lead. This was the man who'd earned a Congressional Medal of Honor, the man who'd led soldiers through impossible situations and brought them home alive. "Your man's got presence," said a weathered woman standing beside Clara. My husband says Luke Carver's the kind you follow into hell if he asks, because he'll get you out the other side. I'm beginning to see that, Clara murmured. The woman extended a work-roughened hand. Martha Hendricks, no relation to that snake from the mining company. My husband Tom and I have a place about 5 miles north. Got the same notice as you folks. Clara shook her hand. Clara Weston, soon to be Carver, if we can find a preacher before the mining company takes everything we have. Martha's laugh was sharp and humorless. At least you've got humor about it. Most of these folks are either too angry or too scared to see straight. Luke called the meeting to order, and the room fell silent. He stood with easy authority, Thomas's pocket watch visible in his vest. Clara had given it to him that morning, thinking he might draw strength from the reminder of his friend. Most of you know me, Luke began. Those who don't, I'm Luke Carver, and I've been on this mountain 7 years. Continental Mining served me notification yesterday, along with 10 of my neighbors. They're claiming mineral rights to our land, offering $500 buyout, and giving us 30 days to accept or contest in territorial court. Angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. I've done some research, Luke continued. Talked to a lawyer in town named Samuel Morrison. He confirmed what we suspected. The Territorial Mining Act of 1866 does give mining companies rights to mineral extraction when significant deposits are found, even on deeded land. Surface rights and mineral rights are legally separate, and we only hold surface rights. Then what are we doing here? Someone called out. If the law's against us, we've already lost. Not necessarily. Luke's voice cut through the defeatism. The law requires mining companies to provide fair compensation and demonstrate that extraction won't destroy surface rights. Continental Mining is offering $500 per property. Morrison says that's far below fair market value. He believes we can contest the amount and force a proper evaluation. That'll take months, Tom Hendricks said. Maybe years. Most of us can't afford to wait that long. Which is why I propose we fight on multiple fronts, Clara said, surprising herself by speaking up. Every head turned toward her, and she felt her courage waver before Luke's encouraging nod steadied her. We contest in court, but we also take this to the newspapers. We make this about more than just land rights. We make it about how mining companies treat people, about worker safety, about corporate responsibility. What good will that do? Someone asked skeptically. Public opinion matters, Clara continued, gaining confidence. Continental Mining wants to operate in this territory for years to come. They need workers, supplies, community cooperation. If we can turn public sentiment against them, if we can make them the villains in this story, they'll be more willing to negotiate reasonable terms. The girl's right, Martha said firmly. These companies care about their reputation. Bad press costs them money, makes it harder to recruit workers, harder to get favorable terms from suppliers and local government. Luke caught Clara's eye across the room, and she saw pride and gratitude in his expression. Clara's made another good point, he said. Thomas Brennan, who died in Continental Mining's Silver Creek shaft 3 months ago, was my closest friend. He died because the company didn't maintain proper safety standards. The support beam that killed him had been reported as unstable 2 weeks before the collapse. Nothing was done. The room went very quiet. If we fight this, Luke continued, his voice hard as iron, we don't just fight for our land. We fight to make sure no more men die, because profit matters more than lives. We demand safety regulations, independent inspections, compensation for workers injured or killed in their operations. We make them agree to terms that protect everyone, not just us. That's a tall order, Morrison the lawyer said from the corner, where he'd been quietly observing. But it might work, not because the courts will force it, but because the company might agree to those terms to avoid prolonged legal battles and bad publicity. So what's the plan? Tom Hendricks asked. Luke glanced at Clara, then at Morrison, then back to the assembled crowd. We form a committee. We pool our resources to hire Morrison and fight the buyout evaluation. We reach out to territorial newspapers with our story. We document every safety violation, every corner Continental Mining has cut, every promise they've broken. We make ourselves expensive to remove and expensive to ignore. And if we still lose? The skeptical voice asked again. Then we negotiate. The best possible terms from a position of strength, Clara said firmly. We make them pay real compensation. We make them provide genuine relocation assistance. We make them agree to safety standards. We may not win everything, but we'll win something. And we'll do it together. The meeting continued for hours, organizing. Committees, assigning tasks, pooling money for legal fees. By the end of the night, they had a plan and a sense of purpose that felt stronger than despair. As people filed out, Martha Hendricks pulled Clara aside. That took courage, speaking up like that. Most women would have let the men do the talking. Clara smiled wryly. I used to be the kind of woman who let everyone do the talking. But I've learned that silence doesn't protect you, it just makes you invisible. Well, you're not invisible now. Martha squeezed her arm. Whatever happens with this mining company business, you've found your voice. Don't lose it. The ride back up the mountain was quiet, both Clara and Luke lost in their own thoughts. The plan they'd made felt solid, but they both knew how easily plans could fail when faced with the reality of corporate power and legal maneuvering. You were remarkable tonight, Luke said finally. So were you. I saw the soldier you used to be, the leader. I didn't think I could be that person anymore. Luke's voice was thoughtful. I thought I'd left him behind in the war. Maybe you just needed something worth fighting for again. Clara leaned against him. We're going to lose the cabin, aren't we? Even if we fight, even if we do everything right. Luke didn't answer immediately, and Clara appreciated that he wouldn't lie to comfort her. Probably, he said eventually. Morrison says we might delay them, might force better compensation, but mineral rights law is well established. If there's silver under our land, Continental Mining will eventually extract it. Thomas's watch, Clara said suddenly. Can I see it? Luke handed it to her, and she opened the engraved cover, reading the inscription by moonlight. Time spent in love is never wasted. Thomas was right, she said softly. Even if we lose the cabin, the months we've spent there weren't wasted. We built something real. We found each other. That matters more than the land itself. The land matters, though, Luke said roughly. That cabin, I built it with my own hands. I thought I'd die there someday at peace. And you've learned to love it. You've made it home. I hate that they can just take that from us. Then we make them pay for it. Every day of delay, every newspaper article, every safety regulation we force them to adopt. We make them understand that people aren't just obstacles to profit. We're human beings with lives and rights and dignity. Luke pulled her closer. How did you get so fierce? You showed me how. Clara closed the watch, handed it back. You showed me what it means to stand up for yourself, to believe you're worth something, to fight for what matters. Now I'm showing you that we can fight even when we know we'll lose. Because sometimes the fight itself is what matters. They spent the following weeks executing their plan with determined precision. Morrison filed formal contest of the buyout valuation in territorial court. Clara wrote letters to every newspaper in the territory, detailing Continental Mining's safety violations and the human cost of their operations. Luke organized the other families, making sure everyone understood their role and stayed committed to the collective effort. The response surprised them all. 3 newspapers ran stories about the Mountain family's fighting displacement. One particularly influential editor wrote a scathing editorial about corporate responsibility and the need for mining regulation. Letters poured in from readers sympathizing with the homesteaders' plight. Continental Mining's response was swift and aggressive. They sent lawyers who threatened countersuits. They sent different representatives who tried to negotiate privately with individual families, offering slightly better terms to anyone who'd break ranks. They pressured local officials to publicly support the mining operation's importance to territorial development. But the families held firm, united by shared purpose and Luke's steady leadership. Every attempt to divide them failed. Every legal maneuver was countered by Morrison's careful preparation. Every public statement from the company was met with documented evidence of their past failures. "They're getting worried," Morrison told Luke and Clara after a particularly contentious court session. "The judge hasn't ruled on the valuation yet, but Continental Mining's lawyers are making noises about settlement. They want this to go away before it damages their reputation further." "What kind of settlement?" Clara asked. "They're willing to discuss improved compensation and relocation terms. Maybe some concessions on worker safety standards." Morrison looked between them seriously. "This is where it gets difficult. You could probably push for more, but that risks them deciding to wait you out through lengthy court battles. Or you could take what they're offering now, which is significantly better than the original terms, and secure something real for everyone." Luke and Clara exchanged a long look, having a conversation without words. "We'll talk to the other families," Luke said finally. "But I think if we can get real compensation, real relocation assistance, and meaningful safety regulations, that's a win. Not the win we wanted, but a win nonetheless." That evening, they sat in their cabin, the carved headboard visible through the bedroom door, and made plans for a future that would have to be built somewhere else. "We'll take it with us," Luke said, following Clara's gaze to the headboard. "Wherever we end up, we'll install it in our new home. It'll remind us that we can build beautiful things even when circumstances are hard. I want to get married before we leave," Clara said firmly. "Before they take this cabin, before everything changes again. I want to stand here in this place that made us who we are and promise myself to you properly." Luke pulled her into his arms. "Then that's what we'll do. As soon as we've secured the settlement, we'll find a preacher and do this right." Outside, March winds rattled the windows, and somewhere in the distance, Continental Mining's surveyors were mapping the land they'd soon claim. But inside the cabin, two people held each other and chose hope over despair, action over surrender, love over loss. They would fight until they couldn't fight anymore, and then they would take what they'd won, compensation, safety regulations, each other, and build something new. The headboard they'd carved together would come with them. And so would everything they'd learned about survival, about partnership, about the fierce joy of fighting for what you love, even when victory looks impossible. The territorial hearing was scheduled for March 28th, exactly 30 days after notification. Morrison had secured a venue in the county seat, a proper courtroom where their case would be heard by a panel of 3 judges rather than a single territorial magistrate. It was a small victory, but one that suggested Continental Mining's influence wasn't quite as absolute as they'd claimed. Clara woke before dawn on the morning of the hearing, nerves making sleep impossible. Luke was already up, stoking the fire and making coffee in the pre-dawn darkness. They moved around each other with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to share space and purpose. "Are you ready?" Luke asked, handing her a tin cup of coffee. "No, but I'm going anyway." Clara wrapped both hands around the cup, drawing warmth. "I keep thinking about what to say, how to make them understand what this place means. Just speak from the heart. That's always been your strength." Clara looked around the cabin, trying to memorize every detail. The way morning light would soon slant through the eastern window, the smell of pine and wood smoke and coffee, the carved headboard visible through the bedroom door. This place had transformed her from a desperate mill worker into someone who knew her own worth and would fight for it. "Whatever happens today," she said quietly, "I want you to know that these months here have been the happiest of my life. Not despite the hardship, but because of what we built together in the middle of it." Luke set down his coffee cup and pulled her into his arms. "We're going to be all right. Even if we lose the cabin, we'll build something else somewhere else. As long as we have each other, we'll be all right." They dressed in their best clothes, Clara in a dress she'd carefully cleaned and mended, Luke in his one good suit that he'd worn maybe twice since the war. As Clara prepared to put her hair up in a practical style, she paused, looking at the wedding dress still folded in her carpet bag. "Luke," she said slowly, "remember when I arrived? I was wearing traveling clothes, but I had this dress packed. The one I'd made to marry Thomas in. I remember. I want to wear it today, to the hearing. She pulled out the white silk, slightly yellowed now, but still beautiful in its simplicity. I made this dress believing I was traveling toward a new life. And I was, just not the one I expected. I want to wear it as a symbol that I came here hoping for a home and partnership, and I found that. That I'm not just fighting for land. I'm fighting for the life I chose and the man I love. Luke's expression softened. Wear it. Show them who they're trying to displace. The dress still fit, though Clara had changed in the months since she'd made it. She was leaner now, stronger, her hands roughened by work and her face tanned from mountain sun. But the dress transformed her, made her look both vulnerable and determined. They loaded the wagon with the carved headboard, Luke's idea. If we're going to show them what we're fighting for, let's show them what we've built. Let them see the care and craftsmanship. Let them understand this isn't just about money and mineral rights. The ride down to the county seat took most of the morning. Other families from the mountain joined them along the way until they arrived as a small caravan. 12 wagons carrying people dressed in their best, carrying whatever artifacts represented their lives and hopes. The courtroom was already packed when they arrived. Continental Mining had brought an army of lawyers in expensive suits, along with territorial officials and mining company representatives. But the mountain families had brought something more powerful: community and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from people who've worked hard and built real things with their own hands. Clara's hands shook as they took their seats near the front. Morrison sat at their table, papers organized with meticulous care. Across the aisle, Continental Mining's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Blackwood, looked supremely confident. The judges entered and the hearing began. Blackwood spoke first, presenting Continental Mining's case with practiced smoothness. He cited the Territorial Mining Act, geological surveys showing significant silver deposits, the economic importance of mining development, and the fairness of the company's buyout offer. These homesteaders, he said, gesturing dismissively toward Luke and the others, occupy valuable land through which mineral resources must be extracted. The law is clear. Surface rights do not supersede territorial interests in resource development. My clients have offered generous compensation and will provide relocation assistance. This hearing is merely a formality. The law is settled and the outcome predetermined. Morrison stood then, and Clara felt her stomach clench with anxiety. Everything depended on the next hours, on Morrison's skill, on the judge's willingness to listen, on whether justice could triumph over corporate power. Your Honors, Morrison began, his voice measured and clear. This case is indeed about law and mineral rights, but it's also about something more fundamental, about whether corporate interests can simply displace human lives with minimal compensation and no accountability for the broader impact of their actions. He gestured toward Luke. Luke Carver, come forward, please, and bring what you've brought to show the court. Luke stood, and with Clara's help, carried the carved headboard to stand before the judge's bench. The morning sun, streaming through the courtroom windows, illuminated the intricate roses and vines, making the wood seem to glow with warmth and life. This headboard, Morrison said, was carved by Mr. Carver and Miss Weston over the course of 2 months. Every rose, every vine, every detail represents hours of careful work. It represents permanence, intention, and hope for the future. It represents what these people have been building on their land, not just structures, but lives and communities and futures. Blackwood started to object, but the lead judge, an older man named Harrison, held up his hand. I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Morrison. Morrison called Luke to testify first. Luke spoke plainly about building his cabin 7 years ago, about finding peace in the mountains after the war, about the work he'd put into making the land productive. He talked about Thomas Brennan's death in Continental Mining's poorly maintained Silver Creek shaft, about the promise he'd made to look after Thomas's intended bride, about building a life with Clara and planning a future that had just been disrupted by notification of displacement. Mr. Carver, Morrison said, what does this land mean to you? Luke was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. It means everything. It's where I learned to be human again after the war, where I stopped running from myself, where I found someone to build a life with. You can't put a dollar value on that. $500 doesn't begin to account for what Continental Mining wants to take. Then Morrison called Clara to testify. She stood slowly, aware of every eye in the courtroom, watching her walk to the witness stand in her white wedding dress. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, and sat down with her hands folded in her lap to keep them from trembling. "Miss Weston," Morrison began gently, "why did you come to Wyoming Territory?" "I answered an advertisement for a mail-order bride. I was working in a textile mill in Philadelphia, and I wanted something better. A chance at a real life. What did you find when you arrived?" Clara's eyes found Luke's across the courtroom. "I found that the man I'd come to marry had died. I found myself stranded with no money and nowhere to go. And I found Luke Carver, who offered me shelter through the winter because his friend had wanted to give me a home, and he felt honor-bound to fulfill that wish. How did that turn into what you have now?" "We built it. Day by day, choice by choice. Luke taught me to survive in the mountains, to split wood and tend animals, and cook over a wood stove. I taught him that his cabin could be a home instead of just a hiding place. We worked on that headboard together, creating something beautiful because we wanted to, because we were building a future, not just surviving day to day." Morrison picked up the wedding dress's hem, let the silk catch the light. "You're wearing a wedding dress to a territorial hearing." "Why?" Clara straightened her shoulders. "Because I made this dress believing I was traveling toward hope, toward partnership and belonging, and a place to call home. I was right, just not in the way I expected. I'm wearing it today because Continental Mining isn't just displacing homesteaders. They're crushing hope. They're telling people that corporate profit matters more than human lives and dreams. I want these judges to see what they're destroying when they rule in favor of the mining company." Blackwood objected, calling her testimony inflammatory and irrelevant, but Judge Harrison overruled him. "The witness's testimony goes to the question of fair compensation." "Continue, Miss Weston." Clara took a breath, feeling strength flow into her voice. "Thomas Brennan died in your mine because you didn't fix a support beam that had been reported unsafe. Luke Carver earned a Congressional Medal of Honor defending this country, and now you want to take his home for $500. 11 other families on that mountain have similar stories. Years of hard work, lives built with care, dreams that matter just as much as Continental Mining's profit margins. The law may say you have the right to extract minerals, but the law should also say you have to treat people with dignity and compensate them fairly and take responsibility when your operations kill workers or destroy communities." The courtroom had gone very quiet. Clara could feel the weight of attention, the shift in atmosphere. Blackwood looked less confident now, and the judges were leaning forward, paying close attention. Morrison let the moment hang, then said quietly, "No further questions." Blackwood stood for cross-examination, clearly intending to undermine Clara's testimony. But the moment he began, "Miss Weston, isn't it true that you have no legal claim to this property?" Judge Harrison interrupted. "Mr. Blackwood, I think we've heard enough. The court is prepared to move to deliberation." He conferred briefly with the other two judges, then looked out over the courtroom. "We'll take a 30-minute recess to review the evidence and testimony, then render our decision." Those 30 minutes felt like hours. Clara and Luke waited outside with the other mountain families. No one speaking much, everyone caught in the suspended space between hope and resignation. When they were called back in, Clara gripped Luke's hand so tightly her fingers went numb. The judges took their seats and Harrison cleared his throat. "This court has reviewed the evidence, testimony, and applicable law. The Territorial Mining Act of 1866 does grant Continental Mining Company rights to mineral extraction. However, this court finds that the company has failed to demonstrate fair compensation as required by territorial statute." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Blackwood's expression darkened. Harrison continued, We are ordering a full independent appraisal of all affected properties to be completed within 60 days. Continental Mining must pay the appraised fair market value, plus an additional 30% for relocation costs and disruption of established homesteads. Furthermore, he looked directly at Blackwood, this court is recommending to the territorial governor that mining operations be subject to mandatory safety inspections, and that worker compensation funds be established for injuries or deaths resulting from mining operations. Your Honor, Blackwood stood quickly. Continental Mining objects to these terms and will appeal. You may certainly appeal, Mr. Blackwood. In the meantime, these are the court's findings, and they will be enforced. Harrison banged his gavel. This hearing is adjourned. The courtroom erupted. The Mountain families embraced, some crying, some laughing with relief. Continental Mining's lawyers gathered in a tight, angry cluster, already planning their next move. Morrison shook Luke's hand, then Clara's, his usual professional reserve cracking into a genuine smile. You won, he said simply. Maybe not everything, but you won what mattered. Clara turned to Luke, saw tears tracking down his weathered face, and felt her own tears start. They'd lost the cabin. That outcome hadn't changed. But they'd won dignity. They'd won fair compensation. They'd won safety regulations that might save other men from Thomas's fate. Most importantly, they'd won by standing together and refusing to be dismissed or diminished.